Good evening, Instructor Wolf. My name is Sherry Hillman. The discussion topics for this presentation will be perceptions and culture. I will be discussing web-based social cognition and the importance of social perceptions when we perceive others of different cultures. Now for some summary of discussion topics. The first portion of the presentation will consist of the following. I will explain what web-based social cognition is. Next, examine how culture relates to our perception of others and ourselves. Then discuss whether or not these perceptions vary across cultures. For the second portion of the presentation, I will compare and contrast American culture with Japanese culture, along with anything researched that might have wowed or surprised me. Finally, I will share with you any perceptions or previous impressions that may have occurred as a result of researching Japanese culture. So what is web-based social cognition? The first part of the word assumes it involves the World Wide Web. With the ever-increasing use of social media and use of internet, the World Wide Web has become an integral part of everyday life. In Chapter 4 of our textbook, Angela Sabates explains it this way. The growing use of technology has led to increasing research exploring the manner in which various social psychological phenomena are enacted in the cyber world. I believe it is a term used to describe how humans form impressions or interact socially with others by interpreting, evaluating, processing, perceiving, and understanding information received online. Now, to examine how culture relates to our perception of others and how it relates to ourselves. Let's first explore how culture relates to our perception of others. When we perceive others, our evaluations are often quick with limited information. This is sometimes called bounded rationality, which means our brains have limited time and capacity to absorb all relevant information to make an accurate decision or correct judgment every time. When trying to make a rational decision or assessment with limited information, the end result is called a satisficer, or we consider it good enough instead of pursuing an optimal answer. Sometimes we perceive accurately enough to make a correct judgment with a positive result, and other times our uninformed decision or wrongful judgment can lead to devastating consequences. Now, let's explore how culture relates to our perception of ourselves. When we look at ourselves and how we relate to culture, in the words of Julian Burrell, we have three choices. We can confront, complain, or conform. When confronting, you believe that your behaviors are the correct behaviors. When complaining, you isolate yourself into social bubbles as a form of living in segregation within society. Or we can conform. This means you are able to adapt to your surroundings. For many, conforming is difficult because we have cultural blinders on. Yet when dealing with different cultures, it is the most beneficial. It indicates that you have a willingness to learn, observe, apply, and understand behaviors of others, then adapt your own so that you fit within the society. To quote Julian Burrell, we all tend to see others' emotional feedback through our own cultural glasses. If you can change the lens, you can change the way your brain perceives behaviors. Only then can you change the way people relate to cultural differences. What about these cultural perceptions? Do these perceptions vary across cultures? According to Voss, Baumeister, and Sciarrocco, 2004, from our book, there is a universal tendency for cultures to require self-regulation and punish its failures, even though cultures may differ as to what impulses must be regulated and when or what failures to self-regulate. Self-control and self-regulate are important and valuable attributes from both a naturalist view as well as a Christian view. Morality is not possible without self-control. Proverbs 25:28 from the English Standard Version reminds us, "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." And Cuddy, Fisk, and Glick, 2008, in our book, further demonstrated that the warm, cold variable along with one's perception of another's competence are principal factors underlying every group stereotype studied across cultures. In Chapter 4 of our textbook, Sabates tells us other people's relational behavior influences our perceptions of them, likewise, our perceptions often influence their relational behaviors. Different cultures interpret body language, facial expressions, and gestures differently. If this is true, we know that perceptions vary across cultures. I want to move now to the second portion of my presentation. I have always been fascinated with Japan, so I will share with you just some of the things I learned about the Japanese culture. Here are some comparisons and contrasts between American culture and Japanese culture. Although there are many, I chose 5 main cultural differences to begin with. In America, first name and nicknames are preferably used. In Japan, only last names are used when speaking. In America, we shake hands, smile, or speak to greet others. In Japan, a bow is used to greet, apologize, or thank someone. In America, we often use hugs to greet for emotional support or when saying goodbye. In Japan, touching is not a common practice. In America, we stand closer when speaking to one another. In Japan, they tend to stand far apart when speaking. In America, eye contact is considered important or shows respect. In Japan, eye contact can be uncomfortable, especially communicating with strangers or acquaintances. Why are these important cultural differences? Because they are the beginning of communications between the two cultures. I also learned Americans and Japanese have different cognitive learning styles. In an article, East-West cultural differences in context sensitivity are evident in early childhood. The authors believe that cultural divergent attention tendency develop through socialization, with existing evidence showing that it largely depends on adult examples. In their study, they found that context sensitivity increased with age across cultures. Americans focus on central objects in a visual scene. Japanese pay more attention to contextual information in a visual scene. Americans use rules and formal logic to categorize objects and understand events. This cognitive style is referred to as analytical. Japanese have a significant greater context sensitivity and use intuitive reasoning and relationships to group objects and understand events, to consider more situational causal factors, to predict more future change from current states or trends, and to exhibit greater tolerance and preference for contradiction. This cognitive style is referred to as holistic. The greatest difference between cultures is that in America, in society, the central social value is considered individualism. Kitao and Kitao, 1988. In Japan, they consider themselves members of a group first. This is referred to as groupism. I found these to be interesting differences in culture, but what I found most surprising is Christians make up only 2% of Japan's population, so Christmas is more of a romantic holiday or novelty, much like Valentine's Day. Christmas Eve is something like a date night. I also did not know how much snow or how incredibly beautiful Japan is in the winter. Has my perception or previous impression changed after researching Japanese culture? It has. I now have more of an appreciation for not only Japanese culture, but other cultures as well. I have more respect for it with a better understanding, and I now have an even greater desire to learn more about it. In conclusion, social cognition is complex on its own. Technology adds just another layer to the complexity of it, and much more studies should be done to help create the boundaries needed for social perceptions of online activity. I learned a great deal about myself by studying a different culture. It is not always what we see, it is what and how we perceive it. We need to change our cultural lenses to help cultural diversity in real life and online be successful. Thank you, and I hope you liked my presentation.